Hello. So today we're going to be talking about how to take great coin photos. In brief, why this matters is very simple and obvious. The better your coin photos are, the easier it is to sell your coins. Also, the greater the aesthetic appeal of your coin, the higher the price your coin might command when compared to others in a similar grade. So let's say you've got a 1916D and somebody else has a 1916D Mercury dime. If you have the coin, let's say in the same condition, but you have better photos in your ad, you might get a higher price than the other guy. Then again, buyers might see how much damage there is to the coin, even if it objectively is in the same condition as the other coin, and the other guy's photos just aren't as good. So maybe it has the counter intended effect. Anyway, so if you want to take great photos, listen on. Here's the equipment I would recommend. Now, this isn't the only equipment you can get. This isn't the only way you can do it, but this is what I recommend. So the first thing you want is a DSLR camera. The second is a macro lens. The third is a copy stand, not a tripod. You're going to want basic lighting gear. You don't need advanced lighting gear, but just good stuff that works. Something that is matte black or matte white for the background, and that can be acrylic or paper, and then something for the coin to stand on. I like something that's cylindrical, and it needs to be of a diameter smaller than the coin so that it doesn't show. The whole point of a coin stand is so that the background, which is either white or black, is out of focus. I wouldn't recommend other colors. Typically, you just want something that's high contrast. So here's a good example of a coin photo. I consider this to be an ideal coin photo because it's got the coin, first of all, head on to the camera, so it's not oval shaped, so it's not tilted to the right or the left, observably anyway. And secondly, it's well lit, everything is in focus. The coin appears to be in pretty remarkable condition, not perfect condition, but very nice overall. And it's just an overall good photo. So let's take a look again at that equipment list, and now knowledge you're going to need as an overview before I get into any detail. You're going to need to know the difference between basic camera bodies, like megapixels are going to be higher on the more expensive cameras for the most part. If you're paying more for a lower megapixel camera, you're doing it wrong. Remote release options, tilting screens, and most important of all, in my opinion, for doing macro photography, coin photography, focus peaking. It's not absolutely necessary, but if you're going from low f-stop to high f-stop to focus a coin to get it right in the middle, perfect focus, I think focus peaking is very useful. You're also going to need to know the difference between lens focal lengths. Most camera bodies come with a kit lens. Expensive cameras tend not to. Versus like an 85 millimeter macro, 105, 200 millimeter. How field of view works and their relation to focal length, distance from the subject, and which of these you can get the greatest distance while maintaining a 1-to-1 ratio, and then the flatness of the object, which isn't really discussed that often in a lot of the reviews I've seen of lenses. But when you're talking about a coin and relief, a coin isn't just a flat object, it has a design to it, so the effect of having a larger focal length and flatness of an object is something I'll discuss later. You need to match the lens to the sensor size. Full frame, crop sensor. The difference is the dimensions are, I think, 1.5. I'll get to that later. F-stop and aperture, how that affects depth of field. Shutter speed and camera shake. ISO and picture quality. How to light a coin. 1 light, 2 light, 3 light, the positioning, low angles versus high angles. You're going to want to know about coin angle relative to the lighting and camera. Manual mode on the camera versus aperture priority versus shutter speed priority. How and why exposure matters more than the megapixels of the camera. Remote shutter releases, camera shake, and again, focus peaking. And maybe I'll touch on how to arrange taking photos of many coins at once to make things efficient for yourself. So to get at the basics, before we look at photos of coins other than the one I've already showed you, actually I'll give you a quick array of some of the stuff I can do with the gear here. After I show you the gear, I'll show you my photos. So you can most expensive option that Nikon sells for cameras is the D850. It's going to cost you at least $3,000. I think used, you might get lucky and get one below that. It's 47 megapixels. Or sorry, 45.7 megapixels. It's very high megapixel. Megapixels don't matter as much as exposure in coin photography. I would rather have a 5 megapixel photograph of a coin that was perfectly well exposed and lit than a 50 megapixel photo of a coin that was out of focus and had terrible lighting and exposure. I don't know why it's not responding. There we go. So D3400 at the lower end of price, you can see it's almost 10 times as cheap. It's half as many megapixels, but bear in mind, 24 megapixels is still astonishingly high. That wasn't something that existed 20 years ago in the civilian market. People didn't have this stuff, but now we do, and it's pretty affordable. This is a very nice camera. It does have the option to have built-in timer, which definitely matters for coin photography, and it has the ability to you can use smartphone apps for a remote shutter release, which you cannot do with the D850. You can use a remote shutter release on the D850, but you have to spend some money to buy a hardwired connection, which has advantages compared to the remote shutter release. I'll get back to that. The D3400 is certainly advantageous in its simplicity. The megapixels actually doesn't matter as much. What I will say is the biggest technological difference between the D850 and the D3400, other than the megapixels, the tilting screen, which enables you to have the camera pointed down and be able to look at the screen, although the D3400 compensates for that because, like the D850, it has an HDMI output, which means you can just connect it to a TV and kind of, it's not cheating. It's just ease of use, right? But other than that, the tilt screen, which would allow you to have the camera pointed down while you wouldn't have to bend over or look at any awkward angles. The D850 also has focus peaking. What is focus peaking? I will show you now. So let's say I want to get a coin in focus. So this photograph is obviously not in focus. It's even more not in focus in this photo. So if I wanted to focus the image, what's in red is focus peaking. It's telling me that's in focus, and what's not in red is not in focus. I move the focus ring just a little bit to get the whole coin in focus, but I overcompensate, and now suddenly the bottom half is in focus, but not the top half. I move it back just a tad, and boom, the whole coin's in focus. Unfortunately, I've got it at f-stop 5. What is f-stop 5? It's a very wide aperture, which means I don't have good depth of field, which means that's what is back up here at the top and what's back down here at the bottom isn't actually completely in focus, but this is certainly more in focus than either this photo or this photo would have been. So back to the cameras. The D850 has focus peaking. The D3400 does not. You do not need focus peaking, but it is a little useful, especially if you're trying to take lots of photos quickly. So here are the lens options for Nikon anyway. Again, you don't have to get a Nikon. You don't have to have a DSLR at all. There are mirrorless cameras out there, and there are, you could try doing the whole smartphone thing, but you can't. The reason you don't want to do a smartphone, as far as I can tell, is because you don't get focus. You don't get a good focusing distance. So, to cut to the chase, what's the difference between these lenses other than the massive price jump? $1,800 for the 200 millimeter, $560 for the 85 millimeter, and these are only retail prices. Obviously, you might get them cheaper somewhere else. The big difference is field of view. So the larger the number is, going from 85 to 105 to 200, the larger the number, the longer the focal length, the narrower the field of view, which means that the further away you can be from an object while still having it appear to be the same size. 105 versus 200 means you can be, I think, about twice as far away and have it appear to be the same size. So that means if you're taking photos of a coin, that you can make it appear You can control the lighting, which is something that's the most important factor of all. So, because a person who doesn't know anything about photography might say, well, if this is a micro lens, that's a micro lens, and this is a micro lens, I can save $1,000 by just getting this lens, and I can certainly save several $1,000s by getting this camera instead of this camera. And you don't have to get the 850, you can just get any camera you want. But a stupid person, or rather an uneducated person, might think that this lens is just as capable of doing what this lens can do. The 85 is equivalent to the 200. But it's not, and the reasoning is simple. The minimum focusing distance of this camera is much closer than the 200, which means your ability to control the light is much more limited. For example, here's the 200 millimeter at a 1-to-1 reproduction ratio, which means you can get a very high magnification image, 1-to-1. 10 inches away, that's pretty far. However, with the 105 millimeter, not even that 85, just the 105, you have to be significantly closer. Look at that gap on the 105 down here compared to the 200. It's obviously significant. I didn't even bother showing images of the 40 millimeter because it's just a waste of time if we're talking about coin photography, since the image, since you need to control the lighting so much. So the other gear you're going to want to look at are lights. That's something else you're going to want to get. Now these are bought, you can buy these from Walmart. They're a clip-on lamp. They are pretty simple. I like the fact that compared to a base lamp, you can mount these to something else and control the height manually, whereas a base lamp always has a limited height. You would either have to get books to put them on or something. A clip-on lamp or clamp lamp makes it pretty simple, and also it's only $5, so you can get 3 of them. You would really want to have at least 3 light sources for coin photos. You want to have at least 3. I'll get into lighting coins later, but I would recommend a clip-on lamp. I wasn't really going to get into the discussion about bellows very much. Basically, a bellows is a way of cheating and not paying the money for a macro lens. And I understand nobody wants to spend, just getting the 105 millimeter is probably going to run you at least $600 to $700 in the open market, maybe $750 or $800 new, used at least $500 to $600. And then the 200 millimeter is going to cost you around $1,000 plus or minus. So what a bellows is about $200. This is the PB4. Again, you can spend more, you can spend less. It's all a function of how much time you're willing to put into looking. And what this lens down here is as you can see, it's very short, which means it's a very short focal length. Certainly not a 200 millimeter lens down there. A bellows takes a wide angle lens, and so a 200 millimeter lens is not a wide angle lens, it's a long focal length lens, very narrow angle. See, the field of view is very narrow on a 200 millimeter lens, whereas on a wide angle lens, it's it's very, very wide, typically meant to take photos of something like a landscape. So if you take a reversing mount and reverse that lens and attach it to a bellows, such as this is an accordion, that's a little hand crank. You can pull the lens, push the lens further and further away from the camera body, and that's a camera body. It takes the amount of light that comes in through the rear element. So that's actually the rear element of the lens that's supposed to attach to the camera body. It's mounted in reverse. And since it's a wide angle lens, what does a wide angle lens do? It takes from the front element, which is attached to the rear here, it takes a very wide spray of light, pulls it in through the optics, and then focuses it down to as narrow a point as possible. When you mount it in reverse, you're taking light from a very narrow point, as narrow as possible, and dispersing it to as wide an angle as possible, which means that the further and further away you move it, like say on this bellows, from the image sensor on that camera body, the narrower and finer a point or more magnification you're effectively getting out of that reversed lens. Now, there are problems about chromatic aberration that can arise with that, but effectively, it's a way to cheat and not pay for a macro lens. But disadvantage of a Bellows is you don't get autofocusing. You're not always going to use autofocusing when you're doing macro shooting. Sometimes I do. I very rarely do that. But you tend, I don't think, depending on which camera body you have, you might not get auto exposure settings. If the camera isn't told the f-stop, if the camera is unaware of the aperture you have it set at, then you have to have the camera in manual mode, and it can consume a lot of time. But anyway, I would not recommend a Bellows if you're new to taking photos. I would recommend, if you had no other option, of getting a cheaper macro lens and then discovering that you need the more expensive macro lens to really take properly lit coin photos. As a good starter, look at the 105. The 105 millimeter is not the best. The 200 millimeter probably really is the best for macro photography of coins, because you get the maximum focusing distance, as I showed earlier. But if you really had to choose one, well, obviously the price is several $100s cheaper in the used market and about half as much on the brand new to get the 105 rather than the 200. So, differences between camera bodies. Megapixels, I've covered how the 850 has many more megapixels than the D3400. Remote release options. The D3400, you can use an application downloadable from the Google Play Store and actuate it remotely. You cannot do that with the D850. You have to get something hardwired to it, like the Cam Ranger. Another option when you're wanting to take photos of coins is to simply use the self-timer option on the camera, and I would recommend it having it a very low setting, like 2 or 5 seconds. You don't want to be waiting 10, 20 seconds. The disadvantage with the self-timer on the D3400, I think you have to reset it every single time you want to take photos. Not with the remote release, but with the self-timer, which means every time you want to take another photo and make it wait 2 seconds, you have to reopen the menu and click on it, which only takes like a second or two, but it's like a hassle. The D850, you have to rotate a knob, and it's one time only, so at least it saves you that much time. Tilt screen, yeah, you can be standing up and look at the D850 or really any other camera that has a tilt screen. And focus peaking, which is probably the most important of all of these. Remote release and focus peaking, I'd probably call a tie. The differences between focal lengths. If you get the D3400, it comes with a thing called a kit lens. That's 18 to 55 millimeters. That's not a terrible lens, but it is not appropriate for use with coin photography for the simple fact that you cannot get a high enough magnification. You have to be way too close to the coin to take photographs of it, depending on the size of the coin. And ideally, you want to fill the frame. You want to fill the entire frame of the photograph with the coin. You probably can't do that with a kit lens because the minimum focusing distance won't allow you to do it. It'll get blurry if you get it closer and closer to the lens. So just avoid using kit lenses altogether for coin photography. I would not recommend the 85 millimeter for coin photography because, again, it's still too close to the camera. You want to have at least the 105, if not the 200 millimeter. Field of view. The higher the focal length, the more limited the field of view. That's what enables you to be further away from it while making it appear to be the same size. So distance from subject. The greater your distance from the subject has a correlation to how well you can light it. The 200 millimeter will give you the greatest distance from your subject. 105, obviously next, and then the 85. And flatness of object. So I said I would cover this. Something very few people I've seen discuss this on a lot of the coin photography websites or forums on coins. The 85 versus the 105 versus the 200, it has to do with the fact that your distance from the subject will influence the appearance of relief on a coin. The further away you are from an object, due to the way that light bends through the lens, on a 200 millimeter lens, it's going to appear as if the coin is flatter than as if you took the photo through the 105. So if you want the coin to appear, and it's very subtle, this is very subtle, and you probably have to take thousands of photos to really notice this, But the further your focal length, the greater your focal length, the 200 millimeter versus the 105, it's going to make the coin appear to be flatter because since you're further and further away from the object, think about astronomy and the stars and a telescope. You're so far away from the star from a star, it appears to be just a flat disk that's a glowing ball or a glowing light. Whereas in reality, it's an enormous sphere. It might not. It might even be oblong in shape or some kind of a spheroid rather than a perfect sphere. So flatness of the object, the further away you are from a coin, it's going to just ever so slightly, very subtly change its appearance because the relief isn't. It's the way the light bends through the lens. You want to match the lens to the sensor size. So something I did not bring up, I will mention it now if you did not catch this. I'll get back to sensor sizes in a moment, but about lenses and how they relate to sensor sizes. So this is an 85 millimeter DX lens. This is a 105 millimeter. Do you notice how the letters DX aren't on here? That's because this is a FX or full frame lens. And this is a 200 millimeter full frame lens. So what's the difference between the D850 and the D3400 other than the fact that they are, well, 10 times apart in price? This is a full frame image sensor on the D850, whereas this is a DX or crop sensor on the D3400. What that means is the D3400 compared to the D850, the D850 has a image sensor size that's full frame, basically the equivalent of the old 35 millimeter film. That's 1.5 times the length and width, or the height and width of the DX lens, of the DX image sensor. The full frame size is 36 by 24. You divide that by 1.5 on each one, that would be 24 by 16 for the DX. So how does that relate to matching the lens to the sensor size? Well, if you want to get a little bit of a cheat sheet, here you go, y'all. Here's my first tip if you want to save money. So let's say you don't really care that much about a tilt screen. You like most of the options of the D3400, and you can live with the 24 megapixels, that's a good megapixel count. And you figure that, I don't have a tilting screen, but the D3400 does come with an HDMI output, so I can just attach an external monitor or plug it into my HDTV. And I don't even really need focus peaking. I can just zoom in with the little zoom buttons on the D3400 if I really need to do that, or look at my TV screen I just plugged it into. So I already recommended not to take photos with the 85 millimeter because this is more of a portrait lens. You don't really want to take photos of coins because it's such a small object. If you get too close, it's just not ideal in my opinion. But you're looking at the 105 and you're thinking, well, both of these lenses cost several $100s. And used, I think the 85 millimeter is something like $350 plus or minus, maybe more, maybe less. And the 105 is at least $500, most of the time $600 or a little more. If you look hard enough and long enough, you can find one for about $500 to $550. If you're wanting to cheat, I already told you this is a DX lens. You can see that's on the barrel there of the lens. This is a full frame lens, so that means this is designed for a much larger sensor than this. So even though it's labeled as 105 millimeters, if you take a 105 full frame lens and put it on a crop sensor camera like the D3400 instead of the D850 size sensor full frame it's intended for, because it's got a crop factor of 1.5, effectively, you are not putting a 105 millimeter lens on that D3400 if you so chose to do. You would actually be putting a 157.5 millimeter, that's 105 times 1.5, so that's 150 plus 7.5, 157.5 millimeter effective focal length if you took this lens and put it on this camera, because this is a full frame lens. This is not a full frame sensor. This is a crop sensor. So even though it looks like you're getting only 20 millimeters of extra focal length, you're actually getting almost double the focal length of the 85 millimeter if you got the 105 and put it on a camera like the D3400. So there you go. Just gave you a big tip there, because this rear element, if you Google the size of the rear element of the 105, or maybe you just go into a local camera shop to look at one, or you might find a YouTube video of somebody showing the rear element, you will see the rear element of the 85 millimeter or any crop sensor lens is going to be much smaller than that of a full frame sensor lens, such as the 105 millimeter. And that is to your advantage, because since it's broadcasting or projecting that light over a smaller surface area, given the crop sensor is smaller, you are giving a larger percentage, the coin or whatever you're photographing, it increases your minimum working distance by having it on a DX sensor. So anyway, there you go. I don't like giving away free tips. You should all donate to my Patreon. Anyway, matching the lens to sensor size. So here we go. The three things that are really going to influence the quality of your images and how they're going to look. So you got f-stop and aperture, shutter speed, and how that affects camera shake, ISO, and picture quality. I will try to give a bullet point explanation of these and then show it in the photos. So your f-stop or your aperture is a series of blades inside of the camera lens, the lens, that affect how much light is coming through the lens, and it's a spring-loaded little tab on the back of the lens if you've ever held one. And the f-stop, or the aperture, it's the same thing. The lower that number is, like on the 200 millimeter, hold on one second, on the 200 millimeter, let's open that up. Let's close this. The widest aperture is 4, and the smallest aperture is 32. So that means that I have either a very large amount of light coming through at f-stop 4 or a very small amount of light coming through at f-stop 32. And obviously there's a bunch more of different options, 22, 16, 11, 8, 5.6. So aperture, the more light you let in, and I'm not sure how it works in physics because I'll be honest, I'm not an optical expert, but essentially the wider your aperture, the closer you get to 4 or 5.6 or 8, the lower your depth of field is, which depth of field means how much of your subject that you're photographing is in focus, assuming that it's parallel to the plane of the front element of the camera, or actually, for that matter, I think the image sensor. I don't want to discuss tilt shift. That's way too much for this conversation, for this monologue. Shutter speed and camera shake. So if you have I'm sorry, before I go on to that, the higher your aperture, so like the closer you get to f-stop 32, the greater your depth of field. However, you're going to run into a problem, chromatic aberrations, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So let's say you got your shutter speed. Most of the cameras, I think the D3400 goes down to 1/4000th of a second. The advantage to that is simple. If you're like at a race car event, NASCAR, and you're taking photos of a car moving hundreds of feet per second, like a 200-mile-an-hour race car, well, at 1/4000th of a second, it's going to be much less blurry than a 1-second exposure or a 1/10 of a second exposure. The disadvantage to a slow shutter speed, which slow shutter speeds are often used for macro photography, is that you're going to have the problem of inducing camera shake. And that's especially if it's a handheld photo, but even if it's not, that's why remote releases exist. So camera shake is a problem, or timers built into the camera. And third and last but not least, in terms of things in the camera you can control, ISO. ISO relates to picture quality, and I will give an example photo right now of how ISO affects your image. So let's say this is my perfect image, and again, the image is what's perfect, not the coin. We zoom in, we see things are very well detailed, coin looks nice, image is not grainy. I move over to the left, and this is a very high, this is the highest f-stop my camera has. Now I zoom in. Oh no, wrong image. High ISO, high ISO. Forget what I just said. Remember the first image I showed you that looked great. So I zoom up here. See how everything suddenly becomes grainy with a very high ISO? ISO relates to how the image sensor on the camera, how responsive it is to light, how reactive it is. I'm looking for the right word. Essentially, you can't change the amount of sensors that are on your camera, but you can adjust the settings, the ISO, for how active they are when light comes in. The problem with setting a higher ISO is that it becomes grainy. So you want to avoid a high ISO at all costs. You want to use the lowest ISO your camera's built with. I think the D3400 comes with a 100 lowest ISO option, which is pretty good. So to jump back to the f-stop. So I got these two images here. This is the one with too high of an f-stop. I think this was taken at f32, and this one was taken at f13. Notice how I skipped f5, which was back here. So at f13, I call this my perfect focus. I zoom in, or at least, or not perfect focus, but my ideal photo. It's not a perfect photo, but it's a very good photo. You see how that's in focus? And it's not just in focus, but it's very clear. It's not just about legibility, it's about aesthetic appeal and presentability. So this is at f13. It's not the widest aperture, it's not the narrowest aperture, so it's neither f4 or f32, it's f13, so it's a pretty good middle-of-the-road aperture. I zoom out, I go back to the f32, which is the narrowest aperture my lens is capable of, and I zoom in on that same image. And again, this is the same coin, it's the same camera, everything is the same, except the aperture is extremely tight. It's the highest I could get it to. That's a hazy image. Isn't that kind of strange? Now, from a distance, these look like almost the same photo. Maybe a very slight variation in light for some reason. But other than that, there's no real reason why there should be that much that much blur. Why is this high aperture photograph blurry, especially when I zoom in? Well, it's not actually the image sensor that was blurry. It's the chromatic aberrations on the lens. What are chromatic aberrations? Well, if you take, here's the front element of a lens. So let's say I've got, every lens is going to have some amount of dust on it, and that's just the front element. There might even be dust on the rear element. Oh my gosh, there might even, oh man, get ready. There might even be dust on the image sensor of the camera, which is the worst. Oh, you really don't want to be dealing with that. But let's say you've got dust on the front element of a lens, and it's at the very, very center of that lens, the very center. If you're using a very high f-stop, so like f32 in that photo I just showed you, then you run into the problem that if the aperture is extremely narrow, then the smaller and smaller percentage of the surface area of the optical elements is being utilized to generate that output photo. So that means that a dust particle, which is extremely small, instead of a very wide aperture like f5 or f4, which is going out as close as possible to the rim of the front element, it's using a greater percentage of the surface area at those lower f-stops to generate the photo. With narrower f-stops like this, if there's even the slightest imperfection at the center of the lens, it gets blown up and magnified. It gets divided over the surface area of whatever image you're taking. But if you zoom into that image, that's how you see the blur like that. And this is very subtle. But the only way to catch something like this is to compare it to an image such as this one, which is f13, which is using a much wider surface area. It's a much wider aperture. It's not the widest possible. But you see how that's a much clearer image? That's exactly what happens. This blur is what happens when you have too high of an f-stop. So you might be tempted to use the highest f-stop possible to get the greatest depth of field, but you don't want to do the highest f-stop. You want to stick with the mid-range. I like 11 to 13, maybe usually no more than 16. Every coin is different. If you're taking photos of metals, or especially if you're taking photos of a coin at an odd angle, you might use a higher f-stop, but I try to avoid them at all costs because of the effects of chromatic aberrations. So I hope that settles that question. ISO, again, that will make the photo grainier. You want to use the lowest ISO possible. Shutter speed, the faster your shutter speed, the less likely there is to be camera shake, but the higher your shutter speed, the more likely you're going to have to use a wider aperture, which will decrease your depth of field. So what is depth of field? I haven't covered that one quite yet. Let me go back here. And let's take a look at f-stop 5. So the moment I put a coin under the lens before I have anything set up, this is what my camera is going to show me most of the time. Very blurry image. It just looks like something's circular, but I don't know what the hell that is. If I actually took a photo, it would probably look like that. Now, if I move the focus just a little bit, it's going to look more like a coin. If I take the photo, it's going to look like that. Now, if I turn on focus peaking on a camera, you can see I've got my ISO setting, my shutter speed's at 1/100th of a second, and that's f-stop 5, so it's a very wide aperture, so I'm not getting a great depth of field here. You can see that I have the top of the coin in focus with that focus peaking, not the bottom. So now I have the bottom in focus, but not the top. Now I have the whole coin in focus. So by moving the focus ring around a little bit, I didn't move the coin at all, even though these images look like they moved. That's because I had to take photos of the camera. That's not actually the coin moving. It's just my unsteady hands. So now that I have most of the coin in focus, I'm not actually going to have that in focus perfectly at the top or at the bottom. So I don't want to actually use f-stop 5 because here's what happens when I take photos with f-stop 5 compared to my ideal photo. If I zoom in at the top on this f-stop 5, look at what happens with my depth of field. Well, I got to let the computer load here. It's not in focus at the very top. I don't think it'll be in focus at the very bottom either. And it's just a little bit out of focus, but you can see just above, it's pretty close. Pretty close. It gets in focus at the middle. So what I do is I use the lower aperture to find just the perfect middle, and then I tighten down my aperture a little bit to something like f-stop 13, like in this photo. And that's how I get nearly perfect depth of field. The ideal depth of field of a coin photo, come on, computer, respond. The ideal depth of field on a coin photo is not a photo where every single thing that could be in focus is in focus. The black back here, it's not photoshopped in or something. That's an actual matte black background. And I know that most people don't consciously think about the background, but as a photographer, you do, because the way you light a coin is definitely going to influence how that background appears. And just to show you what happens if you light a coin wrong, let's take a look at this image. Okay. Now you look at this one and it's solid black. I go to the right and suddenly it's a little bit white on the corners. That's kind of funky. Wonder how that happened. Well, I moved the lights. That's how that happened. So anyway, depth of field and aperture. How I set my photos up is like it shows in this photo. I get it in focus on one part. If I move it a little bit, it tends to be just a little bit off center. Then I get it in the middle. And then once I have it in that middle, I crank my f-stop upwards, and I get it to like f-stop 13, give or take, depends on the coin, and then I snap my photo. I have my camera set to Aperture Priority. I'll explain what that is in just a moment. But basically, it saves me the hassle of having to do everything manually. Shutter speed is almost irrelevant when it comes to taking coin photos, unless you were taking an extremely high quantity of coin photos in a very short period of time, and you absolutely had to have them done quickly. I would never use shutter speed priority ever in coin photography because it's the opposite of what you want to do if you're trying to take the best quality photos rather than the highest quantity of photos. So I have it at middle focus. You can read that over there on the left corner. But it's not in focus at the very top. And then it's a little bit off center. So you compare this photo, what happens, why do I want a greater depth of field than just that f5? It's because if I move the camera or the coin even slightly, maybe I bump the table it's sitting on or the copy stand or the tripod or whatever, this is what happens. It becomes very blurry and out of focus. That's not what I want. I want it to look like this. Hold on, let's let it load. Oh, gosh. It's loading this photo faster. See, it's pretty nearly perfect, I would say. It's a pretty good photo overall. It's always about accomplishing the best you can. You know, would you want it to look like something you could respectably present in $1 million auction, even if the coin isn't worth $1 million? You know, so depth of field, mid-range apertures work best for me. Shutter speed doesn't matter that much if you are not touching the camera. So you don't want to touch the camera, get a remote release. ISO, always have it set at the lowest setting. So lighting, ooh, here we go, the fun part. This is probably the most important thing outside of the settings you use inside of your camera and how you interact with your camera while you're taking photos, so self-timer or remote shutter release. So let's take a look at, before I show you the good-looking photos, let's take a look at poorly lit photos. So this is still a grainy shot because of the ISO, but you can still see it's the same general outline. Without zooming in, it's pretty respectable as an image. So let's just look at a photograph that is from a low angle rather than a high angle. This is a one light photograph, and before I go on any further, this photograph is taken from 3 lights, one at the very top, 12 o'clock, one at 10 o'clock, and one at 2 o'clock. All at the top, none from the bottom, because you want coin photos to look as naturally lit as possible. You don't want anything to be directly at, 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock, and you definitely don't want anything at 6 o'clock or anything below the 9 or 3 o'clock. The lower angle lights are not naturally pleasant. They don't appear natural. They're very ugly in my opinion. And most people, if this is an object of a human, if this is representational of a human being, sunlight would come down from the top, even though the sun is actually in the bottom of the coin. Ignore that for a moment. It just doesn't look natural when light comes from the bottom, and I'll show you right now. So this is a top lit photo. It's from the top left. You can probably get that big hint from the fact that it's very light up here, but very dark over here, especially with that gradient on the left bottom corner. But you can see how this photo, you've probably seen photos like that on eBay at some point in your life, but it's not the best photo you can take. It's only from one light source as well instead of 2 or 3. So here's the one light source again, and this is horrendous. This is very ugly. It almost makes the coin look plastic or something. Might even think it's fake. With this really bad lighting, all these cast shadows, the background, even though it's out of focus, you suddenly become consciously aware of its presence, which is something you don't want to do when you're advertising something for sale. is have a potential buyer put their focus on something out of the focus, or just an admirer. You don't want anything out of focus. Some random filament somehow, probably due to air, landed on the coin, and that's something that in this photo it's probably still present, but it's much harder to see. And so obviously you can just pull that off the coin or blow it off with a blower. But even the black of my little cylinder stand, which I'll get to in a minute, you probably wonder how I have the background so out of focus. It's because I have it on a raised stand, which you always want to have for a coin, and you want it to be of a smaller diameter than of the coin for this specific reason, because it's actually appearing in this photo. So never use low angle lights, otherwise lighting in a coin photo, because you're going to have them look like this. Here's another one. It's low angle as well, and it's from the bottom right. So it doesn't look as bad as this photo, but it's still not very good because this looks just ugly on the top left corner. Now I'm using two lights. Now, what is the difference between low angle and high angle? Well, it's simple. Low angle means relative to the coin's, the plane that the surface of the coin generates. The lower to that plane, the closer to that plane it is, the lower the angle is, or the incident angle. The further away, the higher the lights are away from the coin and essentially towards the camera, the higher angle the light is. However, this is a high angle light shot from two different light sources, both of them at one at 9 o'clock and one at 3 o'clock. So at the angles or the positions I recommended against. Just to show you, it doesn't quite look good. And it's only two lights instead of three. I normally use three, although sometimes I do use two. If you can't tell, the lights are very far away from the lens of the camera which I took them at. They're about, I don't know, half a foot away or more each. In an ideal photo such as, hold on one second. This photograph, the lights were almost touching, if not actually touching, the lens and pointed directly down at the camera at, again, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 12 o'clock. Whereas these are more, this photo was, the lights, there were only two lights instead of three, so 12 o'clock was off, but they were very far away, but still at a high angle, so that's why this photo looks a little bit different than that one or that one. So high angle shot, but too far away, produces this weird look. It doesn't look natural. It certainly doesn't look beautiful. It can actually make a coin appear to be cleaned, even if it's not, and that is the last thing you want, is people thinking there's a problem with your coin when there isn't one. So here's the same lighting setup with one subtle change. I turned on the 12 o'clock light. So those two lights in this photograph were still positioned where they were. Nothing changed. I just turned on the third light. Now, even though it's not perfect, doesn't it look improved? Doesn't it give a little bit of luster to the fields, the devices, and bounces off her chest and the American flag just right? I think so. I think that this photo is better than this photo. But that's just my opinion. And then finally, what did I do? I pulled in the two lights and bam. That's how I got that one. Now this one's actually slightly out of focus if you couldn't tell, but the lighting is virtually indistinguishable between this photo and that photo. See how the lighting's pretty much the same? I can't tell the difference, personally, in terms of lighting. So that's how you want to do it, is have them as close as possible to the lens and as far away from the coin as possible, which again, that comes back to focal length and how much control you want to have over that. So the greater your focal length, the more control you have over the lighting. So manual mode versus aperture priority versus shutter speed. Aperture priority locks down the aperture that you set it at. It leaves aperture to full manual. Only you can control it. The camera does not control it. But the other two factors, shutter speed and ISO, are changeable. I would recommend that you make ISO full manual as well when you're using aperture priority. That way the camera can't automatically change it. This gives you the highest image quality possible. It removes that graininess I showed earlier. But that means the camera can only change shutter speed, which means you can be left with very long exposure times. That's another advantage of using 3 lights versus 1, is that the more light you're putting on the coin, the faster you can take photos. So, and definitely, if I haven't already said it, always take photographs in a dark room where there's no other light sources other than the ones you intend to put on the coin. It's probably not going to create that big of an effect, but if you're working with proof-like coins, the higher the chances are it's going to affect your images because you're working with a highly reflective finish. So anyway, back to aperture priority. The difference between aperture priority and manual is exactly how it sounds. All 3 of these are fully manual: ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop. This is a very slow way of working with coin photos, and you may get a little bar on your screen that'll tell you if you're overcompensated or undercompensated in terms of how much light is exposed. So it's just a hassle, in my opinion, to work in manual mode. Shutter speed, you're never really going to work with, because what it does is it does the opposite of aperture, where instead of locking down aperture, instead of making it so that aperture is user set, shutter speed becomes user set, and it changes the aperture on you and the ISO. So you're just really not going to use shutter speed for coin photos. You will only use shutter speed if you're taking photos of like moving cars, where the ISO doesn't matter as much most of the time, at least. Anyway, but my recommendation for coin photographs is using aperture priority, leaving ISO at the lowest possible setting, removing auto ISO and keeping it full manual, and just letting the camera determine shutter speed and shutter speed alone. That'll save you a lot of hassle and time. Exposure matters much more than megapixels. The man who's got the $3,000 D850 and the $2,000 200 millimeter, probably, if he doesn't have the knowledge as someone who has the $300 D3400 and the $500 or $600 105 millimeter, if he doesn't have the knowledge of the man with a much less expensive camera setup, of how to expose a coin, how to light a coin, of the influence of ISO, the relationship of ISO to aperture to shutter speed and all the rest of it, and how to avoid camera shake with a remote release, how to keep the lighting on the coin right, and how many lights to use and at what positions, at what angles, etc. Money doesn't matter as much as knowledge. So exposure matters more than megapixels. A 24 megapixel image is going to be fantastically astonishing in its own right. So 45, 47, 50 megapixels, whatever, that's great, but it's not honestly absolutely necessary. It'll show you more detail when you zoom in, but it's not completely necessary. Exposure, if this matters in your budget, if I have to be the straw that breaks the camel back, or breaks the camel's back, or be the deciding factor in whether or not you spend $300 or $3,000, let me tell you right now, get the D3400 or some other cheaper camera. Do not get the most expensive camera if it's your first camera purchase. So exposure matters more than megapixels. Knowledge and practice matters more than how much money you've got in your wallet. Remote shutter release, camera shake. If you're taking photographs macro, then camera shake is a very easy problem to run into or generate for yourself. To avoid that, you can use the self-timer. In the D3400, I think it makes you keep opening the menu, which is irritating. I highly recommend, if you have a smartphone and you get the D3400, that you use a downloadable Google Play Store app. It will allow you to set it to remote actuation. That'll save you a lot of time and allows you to not have to touch the camera, which might upset your very carefully devised setup. On the remote shutter release for the D850, you cannot use an app for the D850. You have to actually buy something like the Cam Ranger or something else. I think there are some cheaper options out there, but there's no way to use your smartphone, as far as I'm aware, without buying something that can hardwire itself to the D850. There's advantages to that, because instead of going off of radio frequency transmission like the D3400, that does make it difficult for someone else to inadvertently set off your camera. Focus peaking, I think I've already discussed that, and how In this photograph, what's in red is what's in focus. The D3400 does not have focus peaking. The D850 does. Some of the other cameras do. And you just got to make sure you look up which camera you have, or which camera you're thinking about getting. You don't need focus peaking, but it does save you a little bit of time. It's not necessary, but again, something to look into. And that's about all, other than, oh yes, finally, how to arrange photos to take, how to arrange your setup to take photos of many coins at once. I'll give you all an example right now. So here's a Morgan silver dollar, 1889 Morgan silver dollar. Doesn't it look great? It's actually worn down. You can see from the lack of detail on the chest feathers, but with the proper exposure and lighting, it looks fantastic, doesn't it? Wouldn't you buy that? I'd buy that for $1. Anyway, this is how, hold on, let's wait for it to load. This is how high quality of an image you can expect from a properly exposed, well-lit photo. Now, I don't know what your normal photographs look like, but if they don't look like this, hey, don't try it till you knock it. See that hair detail? It's just astonishing. Look at how much I'm still able to zoom in. That is a function of megapixels, granted, but 24 megapixels is more than enough. This is not a 24 megapixel photo if you're curious. This is more. But anyway, so if you couldn't tell, Morgan dollar, that's the same one. Morgan dollar, that's a $half. So what you want to do when you're taking photos of a large coin collection, let's say, get all the coins of the same size and or denomination and or metal and take the photos of those first. That way you don't have to keep adjusting the height of your copy stand or any of your other equipment. You can just do it all in one row, save yourself some hassle. Then you move on to your $half like this 1937 Texas $half, which is a very beautiful coin, might I add. These are the kinds of photos you can expect from a good macro setup. Look at those wings. Oh yeah. Texas, don't mess with us. Oh yeah, some people think the eagle's a little cheesy. Haters gonna hate, you know. I love that eagle. In God we trust. And bonus tip. So here's an 1880S. It's the same photo, or sorry, same coin. So here's the reverse. Here it is again. Now, can you tell the difference between how I lit these two photos? I changed nothing of the settings other than the lighting, which is how I positioned the lamps. I think this is a 3-point light system on this one, but I used only 2 on this photo. The difference is that this photo, they were all very close. Again, at the 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock, or sorry, not 9, 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock. And then with this one, I turned off the middle light, so I only had one light on at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So, and they were far away from the coin as well. They were not directly above. So it produced this mirror-like, proof-like finish where you can see, and this is just a proof-like coin, so it just kind of brings out its frosty finishes on the devices and the mirror-like fields. That's a good way to create a high contrast image, but you have to be careful about how you do that. This was already a high contrast coin. You can't, I recommend it against doing, if you're curious, I'll open it up again. Let's wait a second. So this is the same lighting setup, essentially. 2 lights, the middle light off, and they're both on at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock and about half a foot away from the lens, give or take. Whoops, why did I do that? You see the difference with a proof-like finish coin? It's ungraded, but in my opinion, it's proof-like. That's the difference between an AU coin, and also the size of the coin, given just the surface area, might affect the ability to move the lights further and further out. So it's not always bad, like I might have made it seem here, to move the lights further away from the coin, but it's a much more reliable, given that the closer the lights are to the coin, it's more consistently appealing, in my opinion anyway. But I'll give that just one last show of what these Morgan dollars look like. And here's a heavily toned Morgan dollar. It's got shades of coffee brown and hints of gold hues. It's pretty well struck. It's just a regular common 1896 Philadelphia. You can see that this coin saturated richly for a long time. It's got purple highlights in it. And then this is the obverse. And so this is how coin angles affect the lighting. This is the coin, I think, parallel to the surface of the lens. This is the same coin, but it's angled slightly upward. So the bottom lip of the coin is closer to the lens. The top lip of the coin is further away from the lens. I think I kept the lighting the same, but it reflected off of the light just a little bit more strongly, which accentuated the toning. And that's natural toning, by the way. This is not an artificially toned coin. This came from my grandma's house. And it's just, wow, you know. And when I got it at first, I thought, oh, some ugly coin. It looked really brown. Didn't look right. But you get these coins under the right lighting, and wow, the history just comes alive. It's really beautiful. But something to be aware of, or leery of, with these highly reflective, or sorry, not highly reflective coins, but when you have to manipulate the lighting on the coin, you might notice the background becomes more apparent. Let's wait for that to load. You don't want that, and so you might have to open it in Photoshop and just crop the coin out and put it on a flat background, black background. If you don't like distractions, I don't like distractions. I would rather have it just look like that or that. It can be difficult to do. So one last thing I don't think I've covered yet. I might have touched on it briefly, but you can see you can see little bits of the background through this photo, whereas it's absent in these photos. The reason why the background isn't completely in focus with the coin, and it's much more similar to this strong black than it is like the coin itself being in focus, is because I have the coin on a cylinder, something that's smaller of a diameter than the coin itself, that raises the coin at least an inch. I like to be more than that, but an inch is fine, off the surface of that the coin would normally rest against. And again, you don't want that surface to be something highly reflective, for the obvious reason that your goal is to keep the coin as the subject in focus and of your potential buyer's attention. So you don't want the background to be in focus. It's not an absolute killer. I mean, I could still advertise this photo, but it's just not the best photo I could get. So this might be the best photo I could get of this coin. I mean, I could probably fiddle around a little more with the light to get a better image. Yeah, look at that. Wow. And see how sharply struck 1896 is? I mean, just every little detail. I love that about high resolution, well-exposed images. Look at that toning. This is what you can get with the right photography. Anyway. So, coin stands or cylinder, that's just my word. I made it up. It's useful for manipulating the lighting like that, make the coin look as best as possible. And that is about it. How to take great coin photos. This might, even if you're not looking to sell your coins for a personal collection or for insurance purposes, this is very useful. So, and it might help if you wanted to ask people their opinion of the grade of a coin before you shipped it out for grading. So, if you got any questions, just let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.